think one of the things we take most for granted about the interactive medium of games is the relationship between the player and the character they play as. All stories have protagonists, but games are the only ones where we can control that protagonist, embody them. Rather than just observing a character on screen or through text like a voyeuristic creep, we have a direct line of communication with them. Every interactive experience has this relationship between the player and their avatar at its core. From The Last of Us to f***ing Peggle, this relationship always says something about the artistic intent or themes behind a game. So in this episode of Harold's Dipshit Ramblings for Perverts, I'm gonna list off some interesting avatars from some of my favorite games and, I don't know, say some shit about them. You know, I kind of look like the mammoth from Ice Age. Before I start talking about the little characters on my TV screen, I want to do a little thing. I think avatars in games can all be categorized on a spectrum that I just made up. It can range from being full, which means they're fully fledged characters with their own distinct identities and motivations, to being blank, which means they're designed to be blank slates, devoid of personality. And there's plenty of space between those two extremes. The theory here is that ultimately the player and the avatar are two different things that happen to be tied together. And the amount of characterization an avatar gets, the more or less fleshed out it is, very profoundly affects the way both ends of the rope work together. I'm going to refer back to this chart a lot over the course of this video, so you'll get a lot of examples if you're not quite following. You'll figure it out, you'll learn. The first avatar we're looking at is Larry David? The customizable avatar of Skate 3 is about as blank as an avatar can get. This avatar never speaks, they make no decisions for themselves, they cannot and do not move without the player's input, they can only obey. It's fully within our hands to decide who this character is going to be. You can style them to look however you want, albeit within limitations. I'm not super happy with how Larry's cul-de-sac turned out. Let's put this avatar straight on the left wing of our spectrum, alright? Larry David has achieved class consciousness. I once thought this blank style of avatar was like the ultimate type of avatar because I bought into a certain school of critique about storytelling in games. Basically, I felt that a player should never have to be an actor in the story of a game, they should be a character. So like, in games with highly characterized avatars, there's this sense that the player is meant to act like the character they're embodying, which can feel restrictive. For example, in Assassin's Creed, you're put in a world with a bunch of civilians that you can kill, but if and when you do, you're given a warning saying your guy doesn't kill civilians, and if you keep doing it, you get a game over. So there's this kind of expectation that you're meant to rigidly conform to a script like an actor rather than express yourself freely. This can especially be felt in the game's linear story missions that desynchronize you if you go off course, as though there's an invisible director yelling cut whenever you go off script. I think that word desynchronize kind of sums up my point here. You have to stay in near perfect sync with the game's idea of who this character is, rather than being yourself and making the character your own. Highly characterized game protagonists are kinda easy to break anyway just through playing, because inevitably the personality of the player will end up competing with them. Example, here's my character talking about like his dead family or some shit, but while he does that, I can make him run around in circles and hump the wall like an excited dog. Even though I'm not breaking any of the game's actual rules, I am breaking the illusion of this character. This guy just isn't written in a way that accounts for the endless absurdity a player can bring. An empty husk protagonist like the one in Skate 3 is a comfy, one-size-fits-all avatar. I'm free to make it act as absurdly as I want, knowing that I'm not derailing it from some pre-written identity. The character is created spontaneously as I naturally express myself through them. I'm free to just spin around, do frontside hand plants, eat shit, listen to Joy Division, eat shit, and bomb in social interactions. While I do think there are a lot of pros to having a blank avatar like this, I have in recent times realized that there's also something to be said in favor of the full avatars that you're meant to conform to. The fact that full avatars tend to conflict with the player isn't necessarily a con, it's just a different kind of relationship a game can have between player and avatar. In fact, I think there can be a lot of intrigue and storytelling potential in an avatar that deliberately conflicts with you or even defies you. Case in point, Raiden. Raiden from Metal Gear Solid 2 turns out to be a very rebellious avatar, but not immediately. He does have a predefined personality and he talks a lot, but ultimately he's a decently comfortable fit. I put him somewhere in the middle of our chart, maybe center right. He only ever yaps during cutscenes, and even within those cutscenes he's written in such a way that makes him an easy protagonist to gel with. Raiden is a sort of stealth operative soldier who's been sent into a conflict zone by himself with the mission of rescuing the President of the United States from the grasp of a band of terrorists. Despite the extreme stakes of his mission, Raiden is a complete rookie. It's said that he has no real-life combat experience, and even his training was all done through virtual reality simulations. Raiden also perpetually knows nothing about what's going on in the story. His handlers are constantly having to explain to him who his enemies are and where he's supposed to be going. The result of this characterization is that the role of Raiden is a very easy one to play. His established cluelessness and his ambiguous competence means that if you're bad at this game or whatever, so is Raiden. If you spin him around and make him act like a goofball, well, he's already kind of a goofy guy, and this whole game has a weirdly wacky undertone anyways. It's kinda hard for an absurdly behaving player to break the tone of a game that's already this absurd. The comfortability of Raiden stands in contrast to the previous main protagonist of Metal Gear Solid. In MGS1, in the prologue of 2, you're told that you're Solid Snake, a legendary infiltrator who's a master of combat and stealth, the perfect soldier. But chances are that once it's time for you to take control of him, you'll screw the pooch. It can be particularly demoralizing playing as Snake because the narrative builds this reputation for him that you're directly violating by just not being good enough. Snake just isn't as flexible of an avatar as Raiden is. Snake does have one big advantage over Raiden though, and that's that Snake is cool and Raiden is not. Playing as Snake in the first game was, to many, a sort of masculine dream come true. He's this buff super soldier with a cool voice, a detached attitude, a dark past, and he's popular with women, at least he is within the written confines of the story. The fantasy Snake provides may have been a major reason why the first game was so successful, selling, I think, record copies at the time. It gave the player an outlet to imagine themselves as a powerful action star, even if they look like this. Taking this into account and coming back to the sequel, Raiden takes on a whole new shape. In contrast to Snake, he's somewhat of an emasculating character to embody. He's clumsier, goofier, and more androgynous looking. There are several moments calling back to Snake as if to show how superior he is to Raiden. The relationship between Raiden and the player gets more than a bit meta at this point. Raiden is sort of like a parody of the player. I mentioned earlier that his only battle experience prior to the events of this game was from VR training, and the visuals we get representing that training look suspiciously like Metal Gear Solid 1. Much like the player, Raiden has also interfaced through Solid Snake, and much like the player, Raiden just wants to be him instead. But he's not Solid Snake, and neither are we. But towards the end of this game, something changes with Raiden. He becomes a rebellious avatar. He pivots hard to the right wing of our spectrum, okay? He's on Fox News now. Turns out, Raiden isn't who we thought he was. So he's captured by the main antagonists, one of whom reveals that they've actually known him since he was a kid, and drops a huge character twist. Turns out, Raiden was never the clumsy rookie soldier we thought he was. All along, he was repressing a very colored, horrifying past as a child soldier in the very real, actual First Liberian Civil War. And not only that, he was an especially accomplished and merciless fighter for his young age, earning the nickname Jack the Ripper on the battlefield. At this point, Raiden the Avatar becomes pretty uncomfortable to inhabit because he's developed, or perhaps uncovered, this newfound identity so explosively. How can we see ourselves in and humorously spin around an avatar that has such heavy emotional baggage? And sort of fast forwarding to the ending of this game, I'm abridging this super heavily so we don't get off the topic of Raiden, but believe me, there's so much more that I'm not going into. We skip to the point that Raiden's arc concludes. After the revelation of his dark past, Raiden begins to differentiate himself from Snake by taking up fighting with a sword, which I felt the need to highlight because I think it's a sign of him forging his own identity rather than trying to take after Snake. Before, he just wanted to be someone else, but now he's branching off and finding his own style. Sort of accepting who he is. After the final boss, who I won't show you, Snake monologues some bullshit about how people can decide who they want to be and what ideas they want to leave behind after they're gone, and Raiden does something remarkable. He rejects you, the player. He pulls out a dog tag that has your name on it, which I think represents your identity, which up to this point has been kind of nested within him, and he throws it away. To find out who he was, Raiden had to shed both Snake and you. The relationship between player and avatar is completely severed now. I wouldn't even put Raiden on the spectrum anymore. Motherfucker Zandatsu'd it. He's not an avatar anymore. You can't control him. He's his own man. At least he was until a new sequel over a decade later replays him and cut people up and shit, which kind of fucks with MGS2, but I don't really care, that game's cool, fuck you. So yeah, Raiden is an extremely fascinating character. I think his story is proof that full avatars can do unique things with the medium of games that blank avatars can't. Awesome shit. Oh, by the way, spoilers for Metal Gear Solid 2. Hey everybody. Before we continue with today's video, I want to really quickly thank today's sponsor, Nuclear Bombs. People always ask me, Harold, how is your skin so clear? Well, I don't know why you'd ask me that. Now, I know Raiden might be kind of a tough act to follow, but I promise there's some interesting avatar shenanigans in this game. The main avatar in Majora's Mask is Link, also known as President Yoon. I'd put him close-ish to the blank end of our spectrum, but not all the way. His personality is in a weird sort of limbo. Like, he does have a character, but what that character is kinda interpretive. He's like this amorphous thing. We get some sparse moments of characterization, like his behavior during cutscenes and in the way other characters in the game describe him, but aside from that, we don't get a lot. I think the most notable thing about Link is that in an adventure game where a lot of it is about talking to people, he never explicitly speaks. Implicitly, he has a voice. We can hear him grunt and gasp during gameplay, so we know that air does in fact escape his lungs, and we're also sometimes given simple dialogue options like yes or no. But outside of those contexts, Link is unable to express himself verbally. There's definitely a pre-written character here, he's just limited in how he can convey that character. In other words, he's just vague enough that he's an easy role to play. There's a lot of room in this character for player improvisation. You know, if you spin your guy around like an asshole, it doesn't feel like breaking character because we know so little about Link that we can plausibly believe that maybe he'd behave that way. Unlike a blank avatar that fully obeys the player or a fuller avatar that the player is meant to conform to, the relationship between the player and President Yoon here is more complementary. It's a very interesting way to do a game protagonist, and I think it works here. There are a lot of pros and cons to writing an avatar like this. The main sacrifice that comes with making Link near silent is that there's now a disconnect between him and the other characters. They're always talking at him, not with him, so there's an uncanny one-sidedness to all this game's dialogue. Link feels like this alien that can wordlessly summon people's attention and communicate only through yes or no answers, and nobody seems to register that as being unusual. It's surreal. I guess that's really the trade-off between blank and full avatars. A blank avatar gives a greater sense of oneness with the player. They can feel more like a version of you in the game, but they're inevitably going to feel like an alien in the game's world because they behave so much differently from all the other pre-written non-playable characters. Inversely, a full avatar has the gift and curse of being a fleshed out individual, which makes them feel a bit more rigid to play as, but it also means they can communicate with pre-written NPCs in a much more natural way. I'll say it again though, these are just different but equally valid ways of writing game avatars. Characters like Raiden and Link, despite being pretty different from one another, are both interesting and acceptable if you ask me. I actually think Link's alienness really works, especially in Majora's Mask, as opposed to most other games in the Zelda series. He's so deeply disconnected from this world in more ways than one. Firstly, he's an outsider. Link's from the land of Hyrule, this game takes place in Termina. He also exists outside this world's concept of time. Unbeknownst to almost all of the non-playable characters in this game, the world's stuck in a 3-day time loop that only Link knows about, like the movie Groundhog's Day. He has the powers to speed time up, to skip forward, and rewind. He's this semi-omnipotent time traveler that nobody understands, and he doesn't bother telling anybody. I guess that's partly because he's silent, but also because when the 3rd day comes, he has to rewind time and make everybody forget about him anyways. He's a perpetual stranger, or maybe a better description is that he's like a kind of parasocial hero. He's on this invisible quest to save this world that hardly seems to notice him. As you control him, you start to develop a weirdly voyeuristic relationship with the NPCs in this game. So like, throughout the adventure, you rewind time probably a dozen or so times, and with every loop, these characters all forget everything and go about the same set schedule over and over. As you complete quests, you naturally start to observe these people and memorize their routines. It actually feels pretty creepy when you think about it like that. It feels a little stalkery. Another thing that makes Link feel like this parasocial alien are the masks. In this game, there are 24 that you can wear. Each has an ability you can use when you wear it, and for most of them that ability is to essentially give you a new identity. There are ones like the Gibdo mask or the Captain's Hat, which trick the undead into thinking you're one of them, and there are ones like the Deku or Goron masks, which let you fully transform into other races, which I really think Link should be cancelled for. Whatever recognition your guy gets for helping all of these non-playable characters is more often attributed to the identities he assumes rather than to him. He himself never integrates with this world, and when the game ends and the time loop is broken and the world is saved, next to nobody remembers him or thanks him. Poor fucker doesn't even get invited to the carnival at the end. So yeah, whatever way you write an avatar, you're always going to have some storytelling side effects that weird nerds like me are going to pick apart. The best thing a game writer can do is recognize those side effects and try to use them to their advantage. If you ask me, most of what we'd call flaws in art can actually be devices when put in the right hands. In Majora's Mask, we play as a masked mute alien who's completely detached from the world he's rescuing. He's an unusual protagonist when you think about him long enough, but then again, this is an unusual game. So it just kind of works. It just works. It just works. They gotta kill me for saying this. There's a lot you could say about the main avatar of Shadow of the Colossus. So much so that I'm only going to talk about him for like a minute before changing course and instead talking about something tangentially related. But I will say, the Wanderer is pretty interesting. He's a very mysterious avatar. Like, despite the fact that we're controlling him, we don't know very much about him. The game opens with a cutscene of him traveling to a place called the Forbidden Lands hauling a dead woman. Once he arrives, he speaks to a spirit who promises him that they'll resurrect the woman so long as he slays 16 colossi that roam the lands. We can only guess why exactly the Wanderer wants to do this, why he's traveled all this way, and why he's willing to risk his life fighting colossal monsters just to resurrect this one person. We're never told what she means to him or what the relationship between the two of them was. The obvious assumption is that she was his lover or something, but that's not confirmed. She could just as easily have been a stranger. I once heard a theory somewhere that he might have actually been her executioner and his attempt to resurrect her comes from a place of guilt. The fact is just ambiguous. He also has a magical sword that can harness sunlight, and it's up to interpretation where he got it from. Is this a hero's sword that he pulled from a stone, or is it a cursed sword that he jealously stole? Ultimately, there's no definite answers, but that's what makes him interesting. The Wanderer, like Link, is just vague enough that we can imprint whatever backstory we like on him. The only thing that's really vital is the contract of go here and kill some cool bosses. Every other detail you're free to fill in. A lot of this character is constructed in the player's head. The Wanderer can kinda be whoever you need him to be. I mean, this whole game with its ambiguous lore and shit, it's like a big mental coloring book, where all the crayons are green and brown. And now I want to talk about some bullshit, okay? This damn bird. This damn ass bird. I made another video last year in which I talked about Shadow of the Colossus and showed a few shots with this damn ass bird, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it ever since. So if you don't know, when you start up Shadow of the Colossus and just leave the game idle for a bit, it'll play an animation of this bird flying around the Forbidden Lands. It seems pretty innocuous, right? It's just a screensaver meant to prevent the title screen from getting burned into your TV, while also showing off this technical miracle of a world from a higher angle. But this bird is a character we see more than once in this game, and that's definitely not an accident. In the very first seconds of booting the game up, we see it. It's the first thing the camera fixates on. For all of 10 seconds, this bird is the main subject. As we emerge into the world of this game, it guides us from the sky down to the perspective of the Wanderer. It's actually kind of a jarring moment when the camera cuts mid-movement into an almost still shot from a pretty similar direction now attached to the Wanderer. Our perspective has been passed between the two, almost tossed. And skipping all the way to the final cutscene after the Wanderer's tail has come to an end, we're once again lifted off the ground by the same bird. That's beyond just repetition, this entire story is bookended by this bird. I think it's a framing device. You could say it's just there to set a grandiose tone or as symbolism relating to the Wanderer, and I wouldn't call you wrong, but I really do think this is something more. I think it's the game pointing to the player and recognizing their place in this tale, because the bird is the player. It's specifically the idle screen that makes me feel this way. As the bird takes off, we can see the Wanderer resting at a save point. As he becomes dormant, our perspective shifts back to this bird. I know it can also shift back to the horse, but the point is that we, the player, are a transferable entity. Think of it like we're a spirit, hopping between and possessing different hosts. The game is characterizing us as this literal omniscient force, which is partly why I think our first vessel is a bird. We're this being that comes from the all-seeing viewpoint of the sky, simply descending down to the mortal world to see the story through before returning to our place in the heavens or whatever. I think the developers did this maybe to say something about the player-avatar relationship. Movies sometimes point to the viewer and characterize them as a voyeur, because movies are all about watching people without them knowing. Games are a little bit different because you're becoming someone without them knowing. You're more than a voyeur, you're playing God. You have the power to play around with this character, this human being, like they're a puppet. Now, the theory crafting side of my brain thinks this idea that the player might be an invisible character in themselves could have some literal meaning or mechanic within the story of Shadow of the Colossus. If you like, you could imagine that we, the player, are literally a piece of the spirit Dorman from the game, guiding the Wanderer to the Forbidden Lands and animating him as he carries out our will. I mean, at the end of the game, Dorman full-on possesses the Wanderer, but we, the player, are still in control. Maybe Dorman was our actual avatar all along? I don't know, food for thought. Another weird but fun thought I had is that maybe we, the player, represent destiny itself. Shadow of the Colossus is a mythical sort of tale and it has themes of destiny and prophecy. The reason why the Wanderer goes on this quest is to bring this woman back from the dead, and the only reason why this woman was killed in the first place is because she was thought to have had a cursed fate, and her killers wanted to prevent that fate from coming true. But like any good myth, the attempt to avoid destiny is what leads us right to it. The events of this game end up being her cursed fate, and that fate only came to pass because she was killed, and the Wanderer wanted to bring her back. We, the player, are the intangible force that pushes the Wanderer down the path of this story, to slay the Colossi and march towards that unavoidable destiny. If the Wanderer is an avatar of us, we are an avatar of fate. You see what I mean?
Will you get the fuck out my ass? You're crazy. What do you think, Michael?
Of course, yes, bruv. The bird and all that. Fucking A, mate.
So I hope you enjoyed the video. I only talked about 4 avatars in this one, which is obviously only scratching the surface. There's a million of these stinking games out there, and you can analyze literally any avatar in the way that I've done, and from a way wider range of genres. I only just realized as I finished writing this that all these characters are from third-person action games. I didn't even mention any POV shooters or real-time strategy games or whatever, but I think you can learn a lot about any game by studying your avatar and the relationships they have with their world and the player. I'll probably do a sequel to this video sometime and talk about some more characters, but until then, I'd be curious to hear about some of my viewers' favorite avatars and whatever little thoughts they have about them. And now it's time for me to descend back into the shadows from whence I came. Good luck out there, kid. Make me proud.